we are picking up now with Joseph. And so he is really sort of the next chapter in God's promise and fulfillment of the covenant, which of course he spoke to Abraham. And so as we look at this morning, we're going to continue to see, to be blunt, still a very dysfunctional family. And in a sense, we can perhaps relate in some cases, because what we see with Joseph and his brothers is a lot of confrontation, a lot of jealousy, hatred that is expressed, all, I think because some want to get ahead of the others and be in charge. And as I touched on a little bit this week in one of the messages during the week, I spoke about how in a family we can have disagreements and problems, and we have to look at ourselves and consider where those are coming from, and we have to make sure we always keep the lines of communication open. Well, that was not the case here with Joseph and his brothers in this particular family. So what we know, just recapping, right? We know that Jacob, when he fled because of some family difficulties, right? You'll remember the deception and the things that happened there. When Jacob fled, he went to his uncle, Laban. And Uncle Laban had two daughters, Rachel and Leah. And so as Jacob was there, living there, he caught the eye of Rachel. She was the oldest, and wished to marry her. And so he took her, and as he worked for 7 years to try and be able to have that sort of arranged, he was cheated by Laban. Then he had to work another 7 years before he could marry Rachel. And so he spent a lot of time, and then as he then moved away, and with Esau, things were made better. God prospers Jacob, and he has some sons. He ends up with 12 sons. All right. The first 10 sons come from Leah, and as we kind of look at it, they weren't all her children. And so one of the things that we sometimes look at within this cultural sort of environment in the Old Testament is that Jacob had intimate relations with a number of women. And so the first 10 sons were born of his wife. She was considered his wife, one of his wives. Rachel and Leah were his wives. And then he had concubines, and they would be the wives of his servants. And so the 10 sons were a combination of children from Leah and children from the servants' wives. Okay, the other women sort of that were under his control. So he had 10, and it was quite a while before Rachel was able to conceive. And her first son that she has is Joseph. And so we pick up on Joseph's story here as one of the youngest. We know Benjamin is still to come at this point in time. And we look at this, and it tells us in chapter 37 is where we're jumping to in Genesis. Genesis chapter 37. Okay, so we understand here, we look at verse 2. It says, these are the generations of Jacob, Joseph being 17 years old. So at this point in time, as we pick this up, he's 17 years old. We sort of skipped over the first 17 years of Joseph's life. He is the classic teenager. And though the toys of teenagers has changed, when we read through this, it appears evident that some of the attitude of teenagers has not changed. And perhaps some of the folly and errors of teenagers has not changed as well, because Joseph displays some less than brilliant decisions as he sort of progresses. We progress through this particular chapter. So we're going to see that and the results of some of those things that are less than one would want them to be. So it says, these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. So there's evidence there of the fact that he had these other wives, concubines. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. So the first thing, what do we see? Within a family, within siblings, and if you were blessed to have brothers and sisters do what? Sometimes they stand up for each other, and sometimes they tattle on each other. They tell on each other. And so this is what Joseph was doing. Joseph would see what some of his older brothers were doing. As the Bible tells us, he reports their evil report, so what they were doing was not good. And Joseph, being the nice little brother, would run and went to father and would tell dad, look, this is what my brothers were doing. Okay? Now, nothing wrong with telling the truth. And if the brothers were in fact doing something that wasn't right, then they definitely needed to be corrected. What we just sort of see, and it's interesting that this is noted in the scripture, it's just gives us evidence of the growing hatred, right, between these siblings. And so even before Joseph has his dreams, which we're going to see next, there's already this animosity. And some of that is natural, I guess is what I'm saying, right? Within a family, sort of a thing. I think as parents, and I mean, I have two sisters, so recognize how that works, right? We fought like crazy. And my younger sister, Benita, whom I love dearly, but she was one, I think I've shared with you before, I could have beaten her to death. Right? We were physical fighters. We were not just yelling at each other, siblings. We physically fought with one another, and Benita never gave up. It didn't matter, how much you held her down or whatever. The minute you let her go, she'd smack you again. It's kind of a thing. So so we had not perhaps the greatest relationship as children and as teenagers, but what one prays for, if you're the parents of those children, is that somewhere along the line, as people mature, that those feelings, any hard feelings can be smoothed over, things can be repaired within a relationship so that siblings can have a closer relationship one with another as they grow older. So, that's, at this point, isn't happening. We also have to recognize there's quite an age spread likely between, the oldest brother Reuben and when we get down to Benjamin, so that in itself also makes it more difficult to have those kind of relationships with your siblings. And again, some people have experienced that kind of a thing. But Joseph here, he goes, he reports to Dad, and then Dad makes a classic mistake by apparently having a favorite. And so he displays, and the Bible tells me, now Israel, so that's Jacob, right? God changed his name to Israel. Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. So this is the classic tale, the classic historical event that we're all very much aware of, right? But here Israel, he displays more love for Joseph, and again, this puts a wedge between Joseph and his brothers. And then the wedge is increased because of this gift of the coat. It's not just the coat, all right? What we have to recognize is this was symbolic at this point in time of passing on a power, passing on of authority. So the older brothers, remember culturally it was Reuben's right as the oldest brother. He would be the one who would receive the inheritance, right? We see all of this, historically we know that was that issue with Jacob and Esau, right? The issue around the inheritance. And so here, when Israel gives Joseph this coat, It's actually signifying that Israel is looking to pass on his authority to Joseph. So again, not something the other brothers appreciate. And then it's made a little bit worse because it's not just that Israel says that, but he gives Joseph something symbolic to wear. Okay. So now every time the brothers see Joseph and he's wearing this coat of many colors, they're reminded of how their dad loves him more, apparently, right? And the fuel in the fire keeps getting poured on, right? So this never goes away. So now we have that sort of added to the whole thing, right? And it actually tells us in verse 4, and when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. So it was constantly a squabbling and a fighting, right? Now God gives Joseph some dreams. There's nothing wrong with the dreams. They're prophetic, right? They are sharing with Joseph, although he doesn't particularly maybe understand them. They're fairly straightforward dreams. The piece I want you to note here is that nowhere do we see that God tells Joseph to share the dreams with his family. Okay? Now that's not to say that there wouldn't have been a time to do that, but here's, I guess, lesson number one for us. You know, if God reveals something to you, you feel that the Lord has revealed something to you, or God speaks to me with regards to a message, a sermon, or, you know, one of you, and the Lord would want me to speak to you about something. That's step one. That's a really important step. Confirmation of that is equally important. And then the third piece of that is, I believe, waiting for the Lord to tell you when to take that step, to speak with that brother or pray with that sister, etc. Right? It's the same with, and I just touched on that, with prayer. We have to ask for the Lord's leading in all things. And so, you know, you may feel led to pray for someone, but until the Lord tells you now is the time, and in a sense, until God has then prepared the ground for the seeds to go into, so we could say the same about witnessing to people, right? Or to your family, all of those sort of things. I mean, I think we all recognize that you can chase people away. It's quite possible, right? And it's also possible to take the same words, but at the right time, water the ground so the seeds will be able to take root, and then it will be more accepted. So what we see here with Joseph is that he has these dreams, but in a sense, again, being a teenager, he's eager to share them, perhaps without totally getting the go-ahead here to share them with his brothers, right? So he has two sets of dreams. The first one, he says, as we go on to verse 6, and he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood round about, and made obeisance unto or to my sheaf. And his brethren said to him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us, or shalt thou indeed have dominion over us? And they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. So again, more fuel on the fire. Now, the debate here, and I don't want to get into the debate, but something to consider, is it all part of God's plan for Joseph to have to go to Egypt? Or is the fact that Joseph is doing these things, sort of setting up the situation where his brothers want to kill him, and he ends up in Egypt because God spares his life. Like, you know, the intervention piece here, one could say, is a little tricky as to say, where is God intervening and where are people kind of going their own way? In the end, we recognize God promised Abraham that he would create from Abraham a mighty nation. Right? We know that. Okay? So through all of these events that are taking place, God continues to steer the ship in that direction. Sometimes there seem to be detours. Right? And so as we look at Joseph, who at this point doesn't know what his future is going to hold. See, we don't see anywhere. Now, this dream is the first indication Joseph gets. Perhaps the coat might have been the first indication, but Joseph hasn't specifically been told by God that he is going to be that next leader that moves towards the, furthering of the nation of Israel. He hasn't been told that specifically by the Lord, right? So we know how the story goes, so we have maybe an advantage, or sometimes that can be a disadvantage. But at this point in time, all we see is this 17-year-old boy, maybe he's 18 now, right? We don't know how much time has passed in here. But we see a teenager, right, who's telling his big brothers, I had this dream and you're all going to bow to me. Okay, well, in my family, somebody would have gotten beaten, probably. Oh yeah, you think that's what's going to happen? And so, again, more hatred. And then he says, after they do this, in verse 9, again, more. He says, and he dreamed yet another dream, and told his brethren, and said, behold, see, he didn't learn in that sense, right? I mean, the brothers weren't really happy after the first dream. Now he has a second dream. And he tells his brethren, and he said, behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars have obeisance unto, or to me. Notice this time there is a sun and a moon, right? So that's mom and dad are included now in this particular dream. And he told it to his father and to his brethren, and his father rebuked him and said unto him, what is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth? So even Israel isn't really thrilled about what this little boy, his younger son, is sharing with him. Now, we also see here, I guess I'll call it the age barrier. Okay? And what I mean by that is that as we get older, we tend to take with that authority. And so when somebody younger tries to tell me what to do, I'll just make it personal, okay? So if Russell were to rebuke me for something, I'll use him as an example, my oldest grandchild. Right? Well, he's 15 now, okay? So if this young whippersnapper, 15-year-old, tries to tell me something, my first inclination, or all of my inclination, may be, who are you to tell me what to do? You're 15 years old. I'm 62. I have a lot more experience than you have, etc., etc. You know how the story goes, right? That becomes maybe even more prevalent if we're not careful. If a young person were to offer an older individual some spiritual advice, the conversation can go the same way. And you may have experienced in your life, and I certainly have, these situations where you may be in a place of authority or leadership, and there are people that you are have authority or leadership over, and they are older than you are. And not all of those people will accept your leadership simply because of your age. Has nothing to do with what you say or what you're doing. But the first thing people often see is this, the physical piece, right? And God, if you look at the scripture, has a way of going against that grain. I think, in a sense, to teach us something, right? Who was King David? Was he the biggest? Was he the oldest? Was he the most handsome? Not necessarily, right? We certainly know he wasn't the biggest or the oldest, and yet God chooses him, right? Who was Jacob? Was he the oldest? No, yet God chooses him. And so very, very often we see the Lord, and even when Jesus is working with the woman from Samaria, right? He goes against these things that in culture and in tradition we've built up as being the way it's supposed to be. And there are times, certainly in the scripture, we see where God says, no, it'll be the way I want it to be. Notice what I'm saying there, right? It has to be the way God ordains it to be. Okay? And so when these things take place, and here we have an example here, right? I mean, mom and dad aren't that thrilled again about this dream where they and all of the other brothers are now bowing down to Joseph, right? So we had a level where the brothers were doing the bowing. Now it's mom and dad as well. So Israel's first reaction is he rebukes. But then if you notice in verse 11, he actually amends his ways a little bit, right? And it says, and his brethren envied him, but his father observed the sayings. In other words, his father contemplated. His father kept those sayings in mind, right? He doesn't dismiss them like the brothers did. I think when the Bible talks about the envy getting in that place, then we tend to dismiss everything and anything that person does. Right? We just paint it kind of all with the same brush. Oh, that's that young person, or that's those teenagers, or those are those young adults, they've only been married for a couple of years, what do they know what they're talking about, or whatever, okay? I mean, we have to be very careful about that. Because Scripture shows us God can use the young, and often He does. And so we have to be open and not swallow everything hook, line, and sinker, right? But prove it, be patient. And here Israel, he contemplates, he observes, he keeps this sort of in mind. And I think that's a shift for him, right? It's this sort of a secondary reaction, and maybe you can relate to this as well. Have you ever been in a situation, somebody has said something, done something, whatever it happens to be, you have an immediate reaction, and then sometimes, and I will attest to this, you calm down, you reconsider, and then you have a second reaction. Right? Sometimes we blame something, and then we think about it some more, and then suddenly, okay, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't that. I actually had something like that maybe it's just a little over a week ago, right? Remember I told you with my, over at the house there was a part I had purchased and it wasn't working, and then, so I called them, because the second one failed, and then I called them, and I spoke to an answering machine, and sometimes it's very easy to speak to an answering machine. And I wasn't very happy, and I let the person know, right, that I just purchased another one of these, and now it has failed again. And I don't expect to buy another one. I'm not going to pay for another one. I told them that on the phone. And you please call me back because we need to figure this out. By the time that person had called me back, I was having reaction number 2. And it had dawned on me that maybe it wasn't the part, but there was another possibility. And it actually turns out it was the other possibility. So I was wrong, okay? And I apologized for that and let that person know in person that I was in error and I had reacted when I should have been thinking. And here, I think Israel reacts, like some of us do, when first, really, what he does here when he observes the saying is probably what we all need to do first. Then react. Think about it. Pray about it. Consider it. Okay? And so he keeps this in mind. Well, the brothers, we know they don't do that. And so they start scheming, right? And it says, and his brethren, verse 12, went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said unto Joseph, do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them. And he said to him, here am I. So Joseph was willing to go. And he said to him, go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brethren, and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. So, different times, folks, right? Today, you pick up the phone, right? Hello, how are things going? You can do a video chat online, you can see what's going on, whatever, right? Obviously, that was not the case here. Shechem was approximately 20 miles away from where their home was. And there's no way of knowing how things were going 20 miles away unless you send somebody to check it out. Okay? The reason that this was critical is because even at this time, still, and even today, people aren't always friendly, right? And so when you take your flock and they had to travel, right? Because most of these, I mean, they would have cattle, but they also had sheep and goats and things like that. And my understanding is that things like sheep and goats in particular, they graze down to the root, right? Like, I mean, even in modern days today, you can see where somebody says, I've got an overgrown patch of land, right? You can bring in a whole bunch of goats, leave them in there for a while, and after a short period of time, it's clean, right? So you've got to keep moving your flock. And remember what kind of land we're talking about here, right? This is not always green and plentiful and that kind of thing. It's basically desert sort of area. So to have to take your flock 20 miles away, well, they had to check because other people had their flocks and there would be fighting and killing and things like that. So basically, Israel is just wanting to check up on, how things are going. So he sends Joseph. He seems to be the one who would be the communicator. He sends him off, okay? When he gets there to Shechem, verse 15, a certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, saying, what seekest thou? And he said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flock. And the man said, they are departed hence, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went with his brethren, went after his brethren, and found them in Dothan. That's another 20 miles away, roughly. Okay, so you can look these things up on the map. All right, so they had traveled, so he's now traveled 40 miles to find his brethren. And it says in verse 18, when they saw him afar off, even before he came near unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. So that's how strong the hatred was. Okay? They didn't care what message he was bringing. They didn't care that he was just coming to check on them, which would be a kindness, right? All they saw was Joseph, the dreamer, the guy who tattles on us, who tells on us, who's gotten us in trouble, and says that we're going to bow to him. Okay? And so they have already labeled him, and they are conspiring now to kill him. That's pretty extreme, right? Even for today, that's an extreme kind of reaction. The piece, though, here is, for us, let's be careful about labeling people. Let's be careful about deciding in our minds, before we even know what's going to happen, what is going to, like we make an assumption, right? And so we have to watch out for that. And here the brothers, they obviously were not thinking about that, so they conspired to slay him. And they said one to another, verse 19, "Behold, this dreamer cometh." And that's sort of a slight against Joseph. May I also add, just a little bit of a question mark, why wasn't Joseph with the flock in the first place? Here he's already now, an older teenager, soon to be adult, and it appears to me he's kind of being babied a little bit. Remember, he's the son of Israel's old age, right? So again, another sort of thing. So they don't label Joseph as the worker, they label him as the dreamer. What's your vision in your mind when you think about a dreamer, right? Sitting around, lazing around, kind of a daydreamer, kind of somebody who isn't breaking a sweat or anything like that, just has these dreams, right? So this is a negative connotation. And verse 20, "Come now therefore, let us slay him, cast him into some pit, and we shall say, some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will come of his dreams." All right, so they're going to put an end to the dreams that he has had. Obviously, you and I, we know, but we have to live as knowing it, that we can't change God's plans. Okay? We can't. So if it is God's plan that they will all bow to Joseph, then their plan to try and kill Joseph so the dream will change, that's not going to work. All right? And Reuben hears of it, verse 21, and he's the oldest brother. And he delivered him out of their hands and said, "Let us not kill him." And Reuben said unto them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him." And then this is sort of in Reuben's mind, that he might rid him out of their hands to deliver him again to his father again. So Reuben, the oldest, okay? So that's important because he has some authority over his younger brothers. So what Reuben says, by and large, the other brothers would listen to. Reuben has a plan. Okay? All right? We'll throw him in the pit, but when my other brothers aren't sort of paying attention, I will go and retrieve Joseph, and I will take him back to Dad. I'll take him back to his father. Okay? So Reuben has no intention of killing Joseph, but he also has no intention of just leaving Joseph in that pit, which, by the way, was probably a dry well or a dry cistern or something like that. Okay, that they would have thrown him into. So he has a plan. His other brothers had a plan, but now Reuben is hoping that he's convinced them to do otherwise, and it kind of looks like he has. And it came to pass, when Joseph was come to his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat. So they took away the symbolic piece that was driving them kind of crazy, his coat of many colors that was on him, and they took him, cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. So that's why we're saying it's probably a dry well or a cistern of some sort. And they sat down to eat bread. They lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said unto his brethren, "What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hands be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brethren were content. So we've also seen here a number of reactions, right? First is kill him, then let's just throw him in the pit, kind of like a penalty. Maybe we'll let him get really hot in there, or we'll starve him for a little while to try and get even. Then there's talk again of, well, let's not kill him. We don't want his blood on our hands. And then you have the one who likes to make a profit, Judah. How can we make some money out of this? Hey, it's far better, like he says, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Let's sell him instead. Let's make some money out of this. Okay? So, different personalities that you see. within that particular family. All right, and so they all agree with that. Right? No, we're not going to kill him, but let's just, we'll sell him and we'll make some money. Verse 28. Then there passed by Midianite merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph unto Egypt. And that would not have been a tremendous amount of money, so they sold him cheap, so to speak, and so Joseph ends up going to Egypt. All of this is taking place. All right. Obviously, not too much love lost between the brothers that they would do such a thing, even that they would consider killing Joseph in the first place. But to sell him into slavery, and some would almost suggest that at face value, that's almost worse than death, right? Because he was heading now to Egypt, and really they had no clue, and Joseph wouldn't have had an idea of what awaits him there, right? Anything could have befallen him, but he's now a piece of merchandise. And so where he was, before, comfortable in his family at the very least, he no longer is. And now Reuben returns. And so all through that, Reuben has been elsewhere. And maybe, and I'm thinking probably, he's watching the flock. Okay? Because they couldn't just leave their flock, so they probably did sort of a shifting kind of a thing. But wherever Reuben happened to be, he now returns and sees basically his plan is, this isn't going to work anymore, because as it says, and Reuben returned unto the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes, right? So he's now at a loss. What am I going to do? He returned unto his brethren and said, the child is not, and I, whither shall I go? And look at again the reference, the child, right? So again, tells us probably quite an age difference there, but Reuben is now at a loss. And when he says, and whither shall I go? He's basically saying, what am I going to do? Where am I going to turn now? What am I going to do? As the oldest, you see, he also had responsibilities. And he has to figure out, what are we going to tell Dad? What are we going to tell Israel about what happened? Right? Obviously, we can't tell him that we sold his son. That wouldn't go over too very well. So you all know their plot, right? So they take Joseph's coat, verse 31. They took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood, and they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, this we have found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. Like, pretty devious. Okay. So what are they asking Israel to do? They're asking Israel to identify the coat. They're not even sort of saying that we found, Joseph in the coat, or anything like that. I mean, obviously they would have known that this is Joseph's coat, or a part of the coat, right? But they want Israel to be the one who proclaims Joseph's death. In a sense, this is this twisting of words kind of thing you sometimes have people say, right? When Israel says in verse 33, it is my son's coat, an evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. The brothers could later really say, we never said that he was dead. You did. Are you following what I'm saying? Right? They set it up perfectly, but they didn't go with the coat and say, looks like Joseph is dead. Look, we found his coat all ripped into pieces. And some might say, well, that's just a small little difference. But those are the kind of differences that we see today in the court system of our land and of many countries. Those are the things that people squabble over. Well, I didn't say that. You said it. I didn't say it was dead. I ask you whose coat it is. So the brothers never actually, tell Israel that he was dead. So I suppose later they could say, well, no, we didn't say he was dead. He just went to Egypt. And so it is Israel who makes this observation, and it's based on what the evidence is that has been given. It's a good conclusion, I suppose, right? But just imagine the pain now that these older sons have put their father through. I can't imagine myself, right? And so it says, and Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, for I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. So regardless of what the other brothers said or did, or the daughters, it references them there as well, this was such an emotional blow to Israel, right? He says, no, I'm going to my grave with this sadness. All right? And it says, and the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. And so the story basically continues, right? The chapter goes on. And as I said, the Lord, we know, because we know the next parts of the lesson, puts Joseph through some difficult situations, but God is always there to restore him, right? To bring him through whatever the trial or whatever the test happens to be. Remember, Joseph doesn't know the end of the story. And I'm going to leave you with the Sunday school lesson with that thought as it applies to you and to me. Okay? But we know, if we are faithful, that we have a home waiting for us. That we know. Okay? But how and what is going to befall us between today and that day that the Lord calls us home, we don't have a clue what that's going to look like. We don't know what that's going to look like. And so that means we have to trust the Lord. Now, Joseph, remember, he had 2 dreams. And in both of those dreams, he's over his brothers and his mom and his dad. And yet now, imagine him sitting in bondage somewhere in a far-off country, not even close to his mom and dad and brothers, doesn't know what's happening to them, because there's no news that travels back and forth about that kind of thing. They assume, or at least the dad and mom would assume, that he's dead, so they're not even looking for him. How is this going to be fulfilled? Right? And so in Joseph's mind, if you put yourself in Joseph's position for a moment, right, the opportunities for doubt, the opportunities to curse God, right, the opportunities to say, Lord, why did you send me those dreams, and now look what's going on? The opportunities to renounce the Lord would be many, I would think. Unless Joseph has faith in the Lord. That no matter what it looks like today, God has me on a path that if I follow after him, he will take me through to the finish line. And that's the way we have to believe, right? No matter what it looks like today, no matter what the gloomy report might be today, we have to believe, sort of like I preached the other week, for the finished work, that victory is ours. We've got it. It's there if we grab a hold of it. So Joseph is on that journey. And we'll continue, or I think it's Pastor John's turn next week, we'll continue with that account as we move into that encounter with Pharaoh. And Lord bless you.